The Day the Dancers Came by Bienvenido Santos. Phil and Tony were both old Filipino men living in Chicago ever since World War II ended. Phil described himself as an ugly old man and described Tony as a good-looking gentleman that looked younger than he really was. The story was basically about a group of Philippine dancers were arriving in Chicago that day, and Phil thought that it would be an excellent idea if he took the dancers around the city, showed them the sights, and invite them back to his place for some adobo and chicken relleno. For the first part of the story, Phil constantly talked about the dancers to his friend and roommate Tony. Phil and Tony have been friends pretty much ever since they moved to the US, and the entire time Tony had been suffering from a disease that frustrated many doctors, in which caused gradual peeling all over his body. When Tony left for the doctor, Phil left a little later to meet the dancers at the hotel. When he got there and saw all the dancers, he completely forgot what he wanted to say and lost all train of thought. So, when he finally managed to gather up all the confidence he had left to invite them to his house, they would just move away or say, "No thanks, we're too busy." Later that night, he ended up going to the show alone since Tony hadn't yet returned from the doctor. Despite the disappointment he had earlier that day, Phil contemplated that if he would just record the show on his tape recorder, he would have the sounds with him to help him remember the dancers, the show, and bring back past memories. When he got home, he noticed that Tony was back. Tony commented that the dancers weren't with him and that he knew they never would have came with him in the first place. Phil then started to listen to his tape recorder, and his failure from earlier that day no longer mattered to him because his recording had brought him a certain feeling, and it just filled him up with different memories and emotions. While he listened, Tony was yelling from his room, telling him to shut his recorder off. When he asked Tony what the doctors had to say, Tony wouldn't answer. Tony then asked what the dancers were like, and Phil told him that they were really beautiful, young, and graceful. He heard Tony let out a sigh, but as he looked down to the tape recorder he held in his hands, he noticed that the spools were spinning, and he finally realized that he had pressed erase. When he tried to play it back, there was nothing except for a screaming part of the finale with drums and the tolling of the bell. When he looked outside, it was already morning. The end.